Hello and welcome. My name is Chris Poor, and in this streaming series, I will be reading the summary for policymakers of the synthesis report of the sixth assessment report by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Put another way, I am reading the policymaker summary of the UN IPCC's 2023 AR6 synthesis report. This 36-page document, released earlier this year, is, at least in theory, the document which policymakers around the world will use to inform their climate-related decisions for the next 6 years or so, at which time the IPCC should release an updated report. In case anyone is unfamiliar with the UN IPCC, I will expound more on what they are and why their 6 reports since 1990 have been at the core of humanity's understanding of the climate crisis. But first, I want to give some background about myself and why I am making this series. A lot of people know that I am climate conscious. I compost, I bike, I turn off the lights. I bought a smart thermostat. I tend to avoid beef because it has 5 times the carbon footprint as chicken. I transitioned my career to the renewable energy sector. I subscribe to community solar. I have a mostly green investment portfolio because I know that for every dollar I hold in the bank can loan out 10. I plan to replace all of my gas appliances with electric ones. I also do silly things like saving gasoline by not running the air conditioning in my car when I can stand it, and not charging my phone overnight because the sun is down, eliminating a potential stream of renewable solar energy, and because it only takes a couple of hours to charge my phone, meaning the remaining 6 hours I have it plugged in are entirely vampiric. And I recently wrote a poem pledging to begin a multi-decade effort to neutralize my lifetime carbon footprint. I mention all of this not because I think my actions are meaningful in the grand scheme of things, nor because I believe individual actions can avert the crisis at all. I mention them to demonstrate that climate implications are an ever-present consideration in my day-to-day decisions, and I have internalized a sense of responsibility to help address the climate crisis. But why? Beliefs stem from experience, and my climate beliefs are no exception. My climate consciousness started when I was a kid. Strange as it may seem, today's rampant climate change denialism was much rarer when I was growing up, so recognition of climate change was the default state. My grade school teachers talked about it, the news talked about it, politicians of all persuasions talked about it. For me to deny climate change as a child would have taken either targeted indoctrination or an act of fierce will on my part. As a high schooler, I watched Al Gore's climate documentary, An Inconvenient Truth. In spite of several instances of sensationalization and misattribution, that film was the first deep dive into climate science for me, as well as millions of other Americans and people abroad. An Inconvenient Truth remains a cultural touchstone to this day and is possibly the most influential documentary ever made. Personally, I think it is ripe for a remake that addresses its minor oversights and accounts for the latest data. After high school, I attended Bradley University, where I took an honors seminar class entitled Global Climate Change. My learning from this class came, of course, from the professor, but also largely from one of our assignments, which was to read the UN IPCC's 2007 AR4 synthesis report. Reading that report was pivotal for me because it dissuaded any concerns that I was somehow being brainwashed by politicians, my liberal arts curriculum, or the media. This is because the IPCC reports are unlike other traditional sources of knowledge like news articles, classes, documentaries, or YouTube videos. Rather than being based upon input from one or a handful of people, IPCC reports synthesize more than 10,000 research papers from all around the globe and then undergo an extremely rigorous, years-long review process, which includes review and approval by representatives of UN member nations. This leaves no room for partisanship, falsification, or conspiracy. I will talk more about the UN IPCC's process later. In my adult life, working as a professional civil engineer, climate is an ever-present part of the discussion. Pavement is buckling under unprecedented heat. Water resources are drying up. Intense rainfall and flooding are overwhelming stormwater infrastructure more frequently. And cities all over the world are developing long-term master plans to cope with anticipated sea level rise. Civil engineering firms are skating to where the puck is going and assembling their teams of technical expertise in a manner that will allow them to capitalize on the coming wave of climate-induced infrastructure spending. So these experiences explain how I arrived at what I believe, but they do not really get to the heart of why I believe climate matters. Many people might share my perspective that addressing the climate crisis is a good thing, but others, who may have had radically different exposure to the subject, might not. Therefore, I feel the need to rewind to a completely blank slate and explain the foundational sort of cosmology that my values and worldview rest on. I will start with some very broad esoteric reasoning and get more granular. Acknowledging that the climate crisis is an existential threat to humanity, not to mention our current standard of life, the question becomes, why do I believe humanity should sustain at all rather than perish? If humanity is responsible for climate change, and if climate change will diminish humanity, then do we not find ourselves in a self-balancing system which we should allow to run its course? Would Earth be better off with a diminished human population? The three most interesting things to ever happen are, number one, the Big Bang, number two, the formation of life, and number three, humanity's so-called cognitive revolution, our development of complex language and society. The Big Bang is interesting because it allowed something to exist rather than nothing. While non-living organisms non-living systems like tectonics and orbital mechanics are interesting, life is particularly interesting because it is a system that is aligned in a certain direction towards survival rather than along entropy, and it requires the conveyance of information through time. In fact, I would argue that life, as defined by self-replicating beings, is a form of biological language, which makes it similar to the verbal language that characterizes humanity's cognitive revolution. Complex language has allowed humanity to transmit information over long durations of time in the form of writings and recordings, as well as over long distances through word-of-mouth relay, letters, telephones, and the internet. My narrative of the universe ever since the Big Bang is far more compelling if it includes self-replicating creatures with the capacity to study, comprehend, and guide the universe in a direction that is meaningful to them. I believe that a living universe is more compelling than a dead one, and I believe sentient beings have superior capacity for meaningful action. In spite of identifying as non-religious, this set of reasoning is probably the closest thing I hold to a traditional religion, because it has no real scientific or mathematical basis. In addition to this cosmic observational stance, I also believe there is humanistic utility in enabling more humans to exist simultaneously rather than fewer. In a population of 1 trillion humans, we should expect approximately 1,000 Einstein-level geniuses, each capable of outsized contributions to human welfare and progress. Some may argue that we should also expect 1,000 Hitlers, but, optimistically, I believe that a global society with the prudent guardrails and opportunities in place would offer far more paths to victory for the Einsteins than the Hitlers, generating a substantially net positive impact to the mean potential of humans. I consider myself to be a futurist and think a lot about what the coming centuries will look like, what humanity will accomplish, and what pitfalls might stand in our way. I have a visceral and passionate desire to play a role in sustaining and advancing humanity toward a positive future. There is no compelling narrative of humanity's future that does not include us getting a grip on our homeworld's thermostat. While things like developing orbital infrastructure, colonizing the moon, and living on Mars are important steps toward the future I hope for, the much more critical roadblock is the climate crisis. We find ourselves as subjects in humanity's first geoengineering experiment, and so far the experiment is going badly. I have two quotes here. The crucial role we fill as moral beings is as members of a cross-generational community, a community of beings who look before and after, who interpret the past in light of the present, and who see the future as growing out of the past, who see themselves as members of enduring families, nations, cultures, and traditions. That's a quote by Annette Baer from The Rights of Past and Future Persons, dated 1981. And another quote, That part of our moral theory that covers how we affect future generations is the most important part of our moral theory, since the next few centuries will be the most important in human history. It's a quote by Derek Parfit from Reasons and Persons, dated 1984. I have a humanistic imperative for sustainability because I believe in the golden rule, treating others as you would like them to treat you. This means more than just being polite in public by doing things like holding the door and saying thank you. It also means being a steward of our shared planet. The actions we take, both as individuals and as an entire generation of humans, will reverberate not only into our own children's lives, but also into untold trillions, even hundreds of trillions of future lives, because our impact on the planet will have centuries-long ramifications. Any act that delays or jeopardizes the ability of future humans to thrive is morally reprehensible. We are both the inhabitants and the crew of Spaceship Earth, and we ought to maintain our vessel accordingly. Another quote, "If global warming extinguishes humanity, according to total utilitarianism, that would be an inconceivably bad disaster. The loss would be all the future well-being of all people who would otherwise have lived. According to total utilitarianism, although the chance of extinction is slight, the harm extinction would do is so enormous that it may well be the dominant consideration when we think about global warming." It's a quote by John Broome from Counting the Cost of Global Warming, dated 1992. Thinking from the perspective of a futurist and a humanist, I can imagine no kinder act than helping our unknown, unnamed descendants pass the ninth great filter. For those unfamiliar, the great filters are various solutions to the Fermi paradox, a paradox which questions the discrepancy between the lack of observed extraterrestrial life and its high likelihood due to the size of the universe. The great filters through which a civilization must pass in order to contact humanity include things like existing in the right star system, having reproductive molecules like RNA, being multicellular, using tools, and industrializing. Many consider the ninth great filter to be a colonization explosion, which specifically refers to the colonization of other celestial bodies. I believe we are near the brink of that explosion, and that the climate crisis poses real danger to our ability to reach it. Conceivably, failing to address the climate crisis could delay humanity's ascendance to the stars by hundreds of years, during which time some other cataclysm, like nuclear war, a pandemic, a meteor, or a runaway greenhouse effect feedback loop, could push us toward the verge of extinction and cost another millennium to build back from. Two more quotes here. "It might well be a familiar progression, transpiring on many worlds. A planet newly formed placidly revolves around its star. Life slowly forms. A kaleidoscopic procession of creatures evolves. Intelligence emerges, which, which, at least up to a point, confers enormous survival value, and then technology is invented. It dawns on them that there are such things as laws of nature, that these laws can be revealed by experiment, and that knowledge of these laws can be made both to save and to take lives, both on unprecedented scales. Science, they recognize, grants immense powers. In a flash, they create world-altering contrivances. Some planetary civilizations see their way through, place limits on what may and what must not be done, and safely pass through the time of perils. Others, not so lucky or so prudent, perish." It's a quote by Carl Sagan from Pale Blue Dot, 1994. And another quote, "We live during the hinge of history. Given the scientific and technological discoveries of the past 2 centuries, the world has never changed so fast. We shall soon have even greater powers to transform not only our surroundings, but ourselves and our successors. If we act wisely in the next few centuries, humanity will survive its most dangerous and decisive period. Our descendants could, if necessary, go elsewhere, spreading through this galaxy." It's a quote by Derek Parfit from On What Matters, Volume 2, dated 2011. So far, I have shared my own personal reasons for being climate focused, but I do not claim they are universally shared by all climate conscious people. Some people are correctly concerned that the climate crisis is driving our planet's 6th mass extinction. Disturbingly, human action has killed 60% of animals since 1970. Others are just concerned about the rising insurance rate for their beachside property. More than a third of the AR6 synthesis report is dedicated to discussing the risks that climate change poses over the imminent decades, rather than in some esoteric, hypothetical science fiction future. Whatever the reasons are, it is worth noting that most humans share climate concern, likely because no aspect of modern life will escape the impacts of climate change. Here are a few facts and statistics. Number 1. 195 out of 198 countries have adopted the Paris Agreement, putting Iran, Libya, and Yemen, who represent 2% of humanity's emissions, in a very slim minority of holdouts. Number 2. More than 110 countries have committed to achieving carbon neutrality in the mid-21st century. Number 3. 67% of humans view climate change as a threat to their country. Number 4. 71% of Americans think global warming will harm future generations, which is a strong majority considering how American politicians use climate as a wedge issue. Number 5. U.S. agencies including the CDC, DHS, FEMA, NASA, NOAA, and the State Department, and many others, have cited climate change as a serious risk to their purviews. Number 6. The Department of Defense has classified climate change as a direct threat to national security since 2008 and a threat multiplier since 2007. Climate skepticism is a national security issue in a world that is bracing to handle 1 billion climate refugees. It could very well be the case that fighting climate change is the most cost-effective way for the U.S. to address the border crises of the coming decades. Number 7. This year, the Catholic Pope issued an apostolic exhortation focused entirely on what he referred to as the climate crisis, writing, "Climate change is one of the principal challenges facing society and the global community. Whether one subscribes to Catholicism or not, the Pope stands as both a guide and a divining rod for the beliefs of more than 1 billion Catholics." I do not cite these statistics to say that majorities have or ought to have a monopoly on truth, but rather to show how many different cultures, entities, and humans have vetted the available information and reached the same conclusion. Regardless of broad belief, there is even stronger consensus in the scientific community, where 97% of scientists agree and more than 99.9% of peer-reviewed scientific papers agree that climate change is anthropogenic. I expect and hope that the AR6 will dive deeper into the basis for this consensus. Given this apparent cultural and scientific cohesion, one might wonder why I feel the need to speak on the subject at all. I am compelled to act because humanity, and particularly the United States, has failed to act. Surprisingly, or perhaps unsurprisingly, that failing is not due to a lack of ingenuity or technology, but rather due to a failure of culture and politics. Firstly, I think human brains are fundamentally ill-evolved to focus on threats that do not have fairly immediate ramifications, particularly when those threats affect people who do not actually exist yet and will never exist if the threats come to fruition. To share a quote, "Existential risks are a different kind of beast. We might find it hard to take them as seriously as we should, simply because we have never yet witnessed such disasters. Our collective fear response is likely ill-calibrated to the magnitude of the threat." It's a quote by Nick Bostrom from Existential Risks, Analyzing Human Extinction Scenarios and Related Hazards, dated 2002. There is some logic in steering policy to help the people who are suffering today rather than the people who will probably suffer in the future. But these statistics do suggest that both a scientific and cultural majority of people want to act now, which means that inaction is due to a misalignment between our politicians and both our scientific understanding of climate change and the will of the people. I do not want to create political content. In fact, I do not even identify myself politically. I believe that people who engage in identity politics and proclaim to belong to either the red team or the blue team have relinquished their intellectual freedom. They have picked a social group and decided to mold their beliefs in conformance with that group. Originally, I envisioned following the IPCC's nonpartisan mandate. Yes, the IPCC is legally required to not speak in partisan terms. But unfortunately, to really understand part of my impetus for this series, I need to discuss the elephant in the room. A 2018 Pew Research Center study asked U.S. adults whether they think the federal government is doing too little to reduce the effects of climate change. 90% of respondents who were Democrats or lean Democrat agreed with that statement, compared to only 39% of those who were Republicans or lean Republican. This partisan divide is the starkest in the world, and it is a huge problem because U.S. policy has powerful and far-reaching effects on the policies of all countries. The study offered some hope from the fact that 52% of Republicans who were millennials or younger believed the government should do more, whereas that number shrank to 41% for Generation X and only 31% for boomers and older. Clearly, younger generations of Republicans are more concerned, which is appropriate given that far more climate impacts will come to a head during their lifespans than in the remaining lifespans of boomers. For as long as I have been cognizant of American politics, I have observed a farce of disingenuous, evolving climate denialism from the GOP. In the 1980s, a few key Republicans refused to acknowledge the existence of climate change. In the 1990s, most Republicans acknowledged climate change but denied that it was anthropogenic. In the 2000s, they acknowledged it was anthropogenic, but denied we should take action. In the 2010s, many seemed to acknowledge we should act, but argued it was too expensive or not the government's responsibility. This year, only one of the GOP's 9 presidential primary candidates was willing to admit climate change is real on the debate stage. To their credit, 73 Republican representatives founded the Conservative Climate Caucus in 2021, but I still place a lot of the blame for the crisis at the feet of Republican politicians who stymied our opportunities to act at the optimal time, now decades behind us, when addressing the crisis would have been less costly and disruptive. In any case, we do not have additional decades to wait for the upcoming generation of young Republicans to reach a majority that will exert their sway on the platforms of older Republican politicians. The fact that a political party has retained so much power for so many decades while being so out of phase with Americans' climate beliefs, not to mention the beliefs of other countries, scientists, and humanity at large, is clear evidence of cultural failure wrought by a loud, sycophantic minority. Partly, this series is meant to inject my voice into that echo chamber. I feel that my votes for political candidates who want to take the reins on climate change have been largely canceled out by votes for Republicans, so I feel a strong need to do more than just vote. This video series is one of few ways in which I can exercise my voice outside of voting. I sincerely hope that content customizing algorithms will not tend to funnel this video mainly to people who already share my beliefs. A lot of climate skepticism from Republicans probably is willful denialism, but a lot of it is also probably earnest ignorance. The sick state of our information ecosystem tends to isolate beliefs and diminish the cross-pollination of ideas. When they go to the polls, people who identify as Republicans versus Democrats are not playing with the same deck of cards. The information they consume leads them to have radically different worldviews. As a society, we need to be playing off the same sheet of music in order to make good policy decisions. There's nothing intrinsically non-Republican or non-conservative about climate action. It was, after all, Ronald Reagan, a widely revered Republican, who ratified the UN's Montreal Protocol in order to ban the use of ozone-depleting chemicals. We face a similar crisis today, except instead of ozone-depleting chemicals, the threat is planet-warming gases. After signing the landmark Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, George W. Bush proudly proclaims, "We make a major step toward reducing our dependence on oil, confronting global climate change, expanding the production of renewable fuels, and giving future generations of our country a nation that is stronger, cleaner, and more secure." Perhaps the timing is a coincidence, but it seems worth noting that Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, released in 2006, falls in the middle of the decade in which climate-denying Republicans went from minority to mainstream. Perhaps Al Gore's documentary inadvertently couched climate as a Democrat issue, bolstering the political utility for Republicans to use their climate stance as a way to signal political identity. Acknowledging that I have indulged in a bit of a political rant, let me clear the air by saying that all political parties engage in deleterious groupthink. I'm not trying to say there is anything uniquely evil or stupid about the GOP or people who identify as Republicans. I think it is primarily a coincidence of history that Republicans have adopted an anti-climate agenda at all. At its core, the problem is that climate became a wedge issue, which was in some way politically logical as Republicans sought to appeal to voters on the basis that they were different from Democrats. Although Republicans are wrong on the issue of climate, their wrongness is not an act of evilness or stupidity, but rather a sixth side effect of America's toxic two-party system. A quote from the first president of the United States, George Washington. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetuated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual, and sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purpose of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. Without looking forward to an extremity of this kind, which nevertheless ought not to be entirely out of sight, the common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it the interest and duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. It serves always to distract the public councils and enfeebles the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one party against another, foments occasional riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which find a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. Thus, the policy and the will of one country are subjected to the policy and will of another. There is an opinion that parties in free countries are useful checks upon the administration of government and serve to keep alive the spirit of liberty. This, within certain limits, is probably true, and in governments of a monarchical caste, patriotism may look with indulgence, if not with favor, upon the spirit of party. But in those of the popular character, in governments purely elective, it is a spirit not to be encouraged. From their natural tendency, it is certain there will always be enough of that spirit for every salutary purpose, and there being constant danger of excess, the effort ought to be, by force of public opinion, to mitigate and assuage it. A fire not to be quenched, it demands a uniform vigilance to prevent its bursting into flame, lest, instead of warming, it should consume. That's a great quote by George Washington from George Washington Papers, Series 2, Letter Book 24, dated sometime between April 3rd, 1793 and March 3rd, 1797. And another shorter quote, "There is nothing which I dread so much as a division of the Republic into two great parties, each arranged under its leader and concerting measures in opposition to each other. This, in my humble apprehension, is to be dreaded as the greatest political evil under our Constitution." It's a quote by John Adams from a letter to Jonathan Jackson dated 1780. My political tangent concluded, I would like to return to the point of this video. I earnestly hope that any viewers who identify as Republicans do not feel turned away by what I have said. Frankly, I think it is far more important for people who identify as Republicans to be exposed to the UN IPCC reports, since for Democrats, the reports are probably mostly preaching to the choir. For my entire adult life, the climate crisis has been by a solid margin my top political issue, probably twice as important as any other. My voting record, at least for non-local positions, is very largely predicated on which candidates I believed would do more to address the climate crisis. It is the crisis of our generation, and I use the term climate crisis intentionally, acknowledging the urgency, difficulty, and scope of the challenge. However, those who do not share my perspective would be entitled to ask why climate ought to take precedence over the other issues that comprise today's so-called polycrisis, particularly over issues which seem to have more pressing timeframes. Many effects of climate change are visible today, but our actions tend to focus on mitigating the risk of extreme calamities that will begin occurring 2 or more decades in the future. While this makes the problem seem less urgent, the truth is that, on a geological timescale, to quote Bill Nye the Science Guy, the planet is on fire. The temperature swings of this magnitude that we see today have indeed happened in the past, but they occurred over hundreds of thousands of years, not mere decades. Today's global average temperature is rising at a rate of 1.7 degrees Celsius per century, whereas it declined at a rate of 0.01 degrees per century over the preceding 7,000 years. On a more tangible timescale, billion-dollar extreme weather events occur every 3 weeks today compared to every 4 months in the 1980s, adjusting for inflation. Wealth inequality, taxes, gun control, healthcare, immigration, education, social issues, drugs, and geopolitics. These are all big, important issues, and they're obviously not easy to fix, but they are easier to fix than climate change because they all involve human systems which we created and know how to control. For the most part, these issues simply require scientific understanding, political will, the signing of papers by Congress, and enforcement by agencies. We do not need to build any physical infrastructure or manufacture any products in order to change our tax codes, repeal the Second Amendment, or alter the flow of money through the healthcare system. Ending the war in Ukraine requires one man, Vladimir Putin, to utter some words, sign some papers, or just die. Resolving some issues might require the construction of certain infrastructure like schools, rehabilitation centers, immigrant processing facilities, or even a wall. But these are far more digestible efforts than replacing literally a billion climate-adverse appliances in US homes, which is only just the easy first step to addressing the climate crisis. Course-correcting the planet's climate will require massive changes to physical systems which touch every corner of daily life. And because we have waited so long to act, that physical change now needs to happen very rapidly. Additionally, meaningful change to our energy systems requires tangential changes to related infrastructure. For example, in order to widely adopt electric vehicles, we need to build up mines and a robust supply chain for lithium. In order to deploy solar energy, we need to make major upgrades to the largest machine ever built by humans, the electrical grid. Even if we had the political will and physical possibility of electrifying everything and shutting off every source of planet-warming emissions tomorrow, we would still be headed toward an unlivable planet. In order to right the ship, we need to actively remove 10 gigatons of CO2 from the atmosphere annually by 2050 and continue doing so for decades, if not a century. Earth's atmosphere currently holds 400 parts of CO2 per million and rising. This means that we have to move 25,000 gigatons of air through mechanical systems in order to siphon out the requisite amount of CO2 to reduce its concentrations to the 350 parts per million level that allowed humanity to develop the modern world. At a fundamental level, even moving that much air is a lot of physical work to perform and will require a massive investment of energy. Addressing climate change is a truly epic challenge, and it requires that we modify some of our most complicated and entrenched systems. We are overhauling our system of energy production, distribution, and consumption, a technological revolution on par with none I can think of in history. The climate crisis affects all of humanity, whereas many other political issues only affect individual countries. For most other issues, the failure of one country to adopt sensible policies does not impact all of humanity. And in the face of failure, there is an opportunity to learn from the examples set by other countries. For example, while Germany can provide demonstrative evidence for how their single-payer healthcare system boosts citizen health while reducing costs, Germany's carbon neutrality alone would not protect German citizens from a warming climate. The success of any one nation's climate policies can only be measured in economic efficiency, but it is difficult to tie their efforts to specific measures of citizen well-being. Our homeworld's climate is a huge system, and it has no political boundaries within which we can divide sovereignty. A ton of CO2 anywhere is a ton of CO2 everywhere. Climate course correction requires broad international policy, conscious, good faith collaboration, and conscientious global citizens. It requires rewiring of entrenched political, economic, and social systems with decades of momentum. Nations ought to contribute to the fight in a way that is fair, that does not suppress developing nations, and that accounts for the benefit that developed nations wrought by a century of unchecked emissions. And all of this must be done over a time frame longer than the typical politician's term limit. Two more quotes here. The threatened inhabitants on this fragile planet must speak out for those yet unborn, for posterity has no lobby with politicians. It's a quote by Bernard Lown from his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech in 1985. And another quote, society is indeed a contract. It is a partnership in all science, a partnership in all art, a partnership in every virtue and in all perfection. As the ends of such a partnership cannot be obtained except in many generations, it becomes a partnership not only with those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are yet to be born. It's by Edmund Burke from Reflections on the Revolution in France, dated 1790. As a kid, I understood that we needed to act to address climate change, but it felt like a job for adults. I am sad to report that over the first decades of my life, the adults have failed, and I now find myself, a 33-year-old adult, in the position of needing to do what I can to pick up their slack. My most basic moral sensibilities, combined with my cosmic perspective and interest in futurism, draw me to focus my energy as both a worker and in my personal time on today's biggest crisis with the longest-reaching ramifications. Fighting climate change has become my ikigai. The climate crisis is a daunting challenge, but pessimism and doomerism have no utility, and there is historic precedent for optimism. Another quote. There are no catastrophes that loom before us which cannot be avoided. There is nothing that threatens us with imminent destruction in such a fashion that we are helpless to do something about it. If we behave rationally and humanely, if we concentrate coolly on the problems that face all of humanity, rather than emotionally on such 19th century matters as national security and local pride, if we recognize that it is not one's neighbors who are the enemy, but misery, ignorance, and the cold indifference of natural law, then we can solve all the problems that face us. We can deliberately choose to have no catastrophes at all. It's a quote by Isaac Asimov from A Choice of Catastrophes, dated 1979. Sustainability is defined as the ability of people to coexist on Earth over a long time. It involves not just ensuring a livable environment, but also sustaining societies and economies that can prevail. The war in Ukraine is not primarily an environmental issue, but like the climate crisis, it is a sustainability issue. Due to the power of modern weaponry and interconnectedness of modern economies, humanity cannot sustain warfare, at least not between major military powers. When I diagnose why our society has failed to rise to the climate challenge, I find that we have not adequately communicated the nature of the situation to one another, resulting in a highly incohesive perspective on the issue. Myopic though it may be, I cannot help but weave a narrative of my own life as contributing to good. To do nothing other than accumulate wealth and consume the pleasures of the world would feel like an insult to all of the people who do not share my privilege, as well as future humans who could suffer lower qualities of life due to my levels of consumption during our age of abundance. I am compelled to act and am continuously listening for the most meaningful actions I can take. Probably 40% of the extracurricular information that flows into my brain does so through listening to podcasts while I walk the dog, do chores, and exercise. Another 40% or so comes from YouTube. Recently, I heard a podcast guest argue that the single biggest thing anyone could do about climate change is to talk about it. While I do occasionally find opportunities to discuss climate, I rarely have a chance to dive deeply into why I am so confident that we are facing a true climate crisis. In many conversations, the reality of the crisis simply goes without saying, and in others, the subject is too deep or divisive to explore, and I do not come to the table armed with an unwelcome climate lecture. So, this video series is my opportunity to take that deep dive through the same medium that I rely on for much of my information, and I sincerely hope that my efforts will nudge the needle toward better climate communication and narrowing the American political divide. Hearing the IPCC's AR6 should enable listeners to more clearly see why countries, corporations, and politicians are taking the climate actions they are. This is because the AR6 is the nexus of humanity's understanding of the climate crisis, and the summary for policymakers in particular is the document upon which leaders around the world are, I hope, making climate-related decisions. I had originally intended to read the AR6 longer report, which is 85 pages rather than just 36, but in doing some preliminary research, I learned that the summary for policymakers is vetted more stringently by representatives of governments prior to release. So, at the risk of being overly conservative, the summary for policymakers should be more universal in addition to being a more digestible read. I may go back and read the longer report, perhaps in a follow-up series, or perhaps not. The algorithmically curated modern information ecosystem truly does place us in echo chambers of ideas, which makes conversations between people with divergent views all too rare. Thank you so much for listening, and please feel free to engage with me on the subject of climate in whatever way you see fit. I am always up for a conversation about this issue. Thank you again, and have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, or night.